Hi, my name is Ivy, and this is a sample class for what our historic classes are going to look like at Sparks Academy. This year we are offering Exploring America through Knotgrass, Exploring World History through Knotgrass, and also Government and Civics, which the textbook is provided through the program. So I want to dive in and just show you what the classes look like on Canvas so that you have an idea of what your student will be looking at. Okay, looking inside of a history class, I have pulled up Government and Economics. This is your home page, and this is where they will be able to access announcements, discussion, assignments. There's a file section that has all of these pieces to download. The student textbook and the answer key came in purchase download. So when you purchase the course, that's when you're able to download those pieces. If for some reason you didn't get that download link or you didn't realize it was there, you'll just need to contact us so that we can regenerate your download links. In addition to these files, your student is going to want to have a digital notebook through Google Docs or OneDrive where they can keep up with all of their writing assignments in the same place so that they're easy to turn in when the time comes. They'll also want access to Canva or some other sort of online graphic design program because we'll be making infographics. And when we get to the economics side of this course, they'll be making different graphics, different sales things. I'll get to that in just a moment. So if your student goes over to their account and enables the notifications in their settings, anytime an announcement, discussion, or assignment is added, they will get an email. Let's just pick an assignment. What's on week 4? So for week 4, the topic is the American Revolution and the French Revolution. We'll be looking at how those two revolutions actually had quite a bit in common and how they affected each other. Their assignment for that week is the written work for chapter 2. Written work will include multiple choice, matching, short answer, essay, vocabulary work. All of that is encompassed in the written work. And then they have some extra videos to watch. At the bottom here, each week there will be a discussion question added. They are expected to post their thoughts on that discussion. They're also expected to do peer review, which is where they go into someone else's thread and make comments on other thoughts. Now, a couple of words, particularly about the government class, but it also pertains to the history classes. These classes are nonpartisan. Sometimes they're going to lean a little left, sometimes they're going to lean a little right. It's just the nature of how government history work. However, we have done our very best as a group of teachers, because I do have other people working with me, to make sure that these classes are unbiased. So if you are looking for a particular slant, left or right, then Sparks Academy may not be the place for you. If you're looking for a place for your student to be exposed to all kinds of ideas, then this is politically, then this is going to be more the place for you. Also, with our student discussions, our peer discussions, we don't shut people down for having different ideas. We do expect people to express themselves respectfully and to be respectful of their differences with others, though. Up here between weekly assignments and videos is where the class lecture will be each week. This is 20 to 30 minutes of myself giving the presentation. I also have guest speakers that are coming on to speak about different topics pertaining to government and economics. So with this particular class that we're in, government, the entire first semester is government, the entire second semester is economics. And each quarter, we will have a live class where we all get on, the students will all get on and we'll meet together and we'll talk things through live. Now, if your student cannot make that class, those are all going to be recorded. They're down here in the conferences section. There aren't any right now, but there would be a button right around here that says join. While those dates are already in the syllabus, so you would know which week they are, we do not have actual dates and times lined up yet. However, they'll have plenty of notice. If they can't come, it'll be recorded. We would just ask that they watch the playback and participate in the discussion before the next week. For the first semester government, the students will be assigned to various groups. They're going to be researching topics and then they'll be doing mock debate. For the second semester, which is economics, they're going to have a chance to practice young entrepreneurship. If you're familiar with the show Shark Tank, one of the things we have lined up for the economics semester is they will be doing idea pitches where they pitch their small business. They'll also be learning about taxes and startup costs and marketing and all of the little pieces that make up a small business. If your student is not interested in starting his or her own business, then they can come up with a fictitious one. But we've found that a lot of students, especially teenagers, are interested in starting something small of their own. So I am going to leave you with a sample class from one of our history classes now, and I hope that this helps you to make a decision on whether Sparks Academy is right for you. Hello, welcome to week 3 of Exploring America. We're going to start getting a little bit deeper into our discussion this week, and I want to go right to what we're talking about. So when you log into your Canvas this week, you'll see that we're talking about the scientific revolution, the French and Indian Wars, and the new laws that came about as a result of those wars. You also have a few videos to watch this week. And then you'll have your discussion question down at the bottom. Don't forget to participate in that. I'll talk about that in your class lecture. Your assignments this week are to read Unit 3, which is pages 53 to 78. You should be taking notes as you're going through this. First of all, to prepare for your test, but second of all, because it's good to get in the habit of taking notes and finding a system that works for you. Your writing assignment is either number 2 or number 3 on page 54. Be sure to put this into your Google Doc or your OneDrive so that you have it for easy access. And make sure to include the date and the writing prompt for each entry. I'm more particular about the writing prompt than about the date, because when it's time to grade it, if I don't know what your topic was, it's going to be very difficult to know how you did on writing. And you have your unit test. Your parent has the quiz answers. Those are in the file downloads. Be sure to keep track of your score on the grade sheet because you'll want to turn those in each semester. So the first thing we're going to talk about is the scientific revolution. The scientific revolution took place in Europe in the 16th, 17th, and 18th century, and it was a movement that established scientific supremacy over the church teachings. They were based on Aristotelian thinking, as well as the discoveries of the ancient Greeks and the Romans in the Bible. After the 16th century, people began to emphasize the idea of reason and knowledge to acquire in scientific. After the 16th century, people began to emphasize the idea of reason and knowledge to acquire scientific observation. The time of the scientific revolution was when people would no longer look to the church for answers. This would be when we started seeing a split between the Catholic Church and the scientists, maybe like Newton, who kind of went underground. There were major theories that took place during this time that revolutionized people's thinking about the natural world. Talking about churches versus scientists, if you know the Indigo Girls song, Galileo, he's a good example. So Nicholas Copernicus was a Polish scientist that introduced the heliocentric theory, which proposed that it was the sun rather than the earth that was the center of our solar system, and that the earth revolved around it as well as other planets. This rejected the ancient geocentric theory, geo meaning the earth, saying that the earth was the center of the universe. Johannes Kepler was a German scientist that talked about planetary motion. He agreed with Copernicus that the sun was the center of the solar system and that the planets revolved around it. But Kepler noticed that the planets had elliptical orbits rather than circular. Galileo Galilei was an Italian astronomer from Pisa who invented the telescope. And by using his telescope, he confirmed the theories that Kepler and Copernicus had established. The church did not like this. It went against their teachings. Isaac Newton was an English physicist and mathematician that revolutionized scientific thinking by discovering gravity. And William Harvey was an English physician that discovered the blood circulates through the human system, bringing oxygen from the heart to the rest of the system. During the scientific revolution, the church went down in importance for answering people's basic questions about nature, and that science went up. So the importance and the outcomes of this scientific revolution, it was basically Bible versus science. There was an emphasis on reason and systematic observation of nature. There was a formulation of the scientific method and expansion of scientific knowledge. Let's look at some important people from the scientific revolution. You'll have already seen some of them. We talked about Copernicus. He lived from 1473 to 1543. And was a Polish astronomer, mathematician, and economist. He's the one who developed that heliocentric theory, which said that the sun was the center of the universe. This theory was a fundamental starting point for modern astronomy and modern science itself. His work affected many other aspects of human life, opening the door to young astronomers everywhere to challenge the facts and never take anything at face value. So here we have the heliocentric model on one side and the geocentric model on the other. At the time that Copernicus proposed his theory, most people assumed that the geocentric model was true. We have Galileo Galilei, who lived from 1564 to 1642. He was an Italian astronomer He was an Italian astronomer who was an important part of the scientific revolution. He made the telescope, made some of those first astronomical observations, and made the first law of motion. He fully supported the teachings of Copernicus. He's often called the father of modern astronomy, physics, and science. But because of his beliefs, he was branded a heretic by the Roman Catholic Church and imprisoned on house arrest for life. The church decided that the heliocentric model was a heresy, but Galileo continued to argue in favor of the theory and published his reasoning. The Inquisition in Rome accused him of heresy and required him to answer. He was put under arrest and sentenced to prison, but because he was famous and extremely old at the time, he was 70, he was allowed to serve house arrest in Florence at his home for the remaining years of his life. We have Johannes Kepler, living from 1571 to 1630. He was born in Southwest Germany and became a professor of mathematics at a Protestant seminary in Austria, where he pursued the study of astronomy and astrology. Those are two different things. One is the study of the stars, and the other is the study of how the stars affect us. In 1609, his work called the Astronomia Nova, the new astronomy, appeared, containing 3 laws of planetary motion. One of these states that the planets move in elliptical orbits with the sun at one focus. Another states that the planets sweep out equal areas in equal times. In 1610, he heard about Galileo's discoveries with the spyglass and wrote letters which were an enormous support to Galileo. The discoveries were doubted and denied by the Catholic Church, though. Kepler also suffered persecutions at the hands of the church. He is considered to be the founder of physical astronomy. We can see here how he proposed that the earth moves around the sun. Francis Bacon may not be someone that you think of with the scientific revolution. He lived from 1561 to 1626 and was an English philosopher, statesman, essayist, and defender. His works established and popularized an inductive method for scientists to use to explore things that they did not fully understand. It was called the Baconian method, or what we know as the scientific method. And it's still used as a framework for scientific research today. He is credited with the establishment of the Royal Society of London, an organization for the advancement of scientific knowledge. He's also credited with saying, knowledge is power. I'm sure you've probably seen the steps to the scientific method. Question, which is asking what would happen if. Hypothesize, research and make an educated guess. Experiment, that would be testing your hypothesis. Observing and recording, making a chart, writing down your data. Analyzing, using that data to draw conclusions, and sharing your results through things like scientific journals. Then we have Isaac Newton, who lived from 1642 to 1727. He was an English physicist, mathematician, astronomer, and philosopher. He stated the 3 universal laws of motion that were not improved upon for more than 200 years. He used the Latin word gravitas, or weight, for the force that would become known as gravity, and defined the law of universal gravitation. This law was developed after watching an apple fall while in his orchard. In 1703, Newton became the president of that Royal Society of London. He is considered one of history's greatest scientists, ranking alongside such figures as Einstein and Gauss. This looks like Pink Floyd's Dark Side of the Moon, but what this is in 1666, after a series of experiments, Newton concluded that white light consists of a spectrum of colors, which was a breakthrough in the field of optics. And it looks pretty. Newton's calculations changed the way that people understood the universe. No one had been able to help them understand why the planets stayed in their orbits. Why did they stay up? Less than 50 years before Newton was born, it was thought that the planets were held in place by an invisible shield. but Isaac proved that they were held in place by the sun's gravity. He also showed that the force of gravity was affected by distance and mass. He was not the first to understand that the orbit of a planet was not circular, but more elongated like an oval. What he did, however, was explain how that worked. This is an example. If you've seen one of those quarter things at the mall where you can spin the quarter around and around until it drops, that would be an example of what's happening here. And those are some important people from the scientific revolution. All right, I want to switch gears and jump forward about 200 years in history and talk about the French and Indian War. John Adams in 1765, after the French and Indian Wars had ended, said, "The people, even to their lowest ranks, have become more attentive to their liberties, more inquisitive about them, and more determined to defend them than they ever would known before or had occasion to be." From 1689 until 1763, Spain, England, and France fought a series of wars. They fought them not only in Europe, but over here in America as well. France was becoming a large imperial power. They had settled in Canada. You can see France right here in blue, and along the entire Mississippi River. And they had become very large players in the fur trade. They formed economic and military alliances with Native American groups. So on our map here, you can see that Britain is red, Spain is yellow, and then we have the unexplored territories up here in green. From 1689 to 1697, England and France were at war over in Europe. In the colonies, colonists in New England fought the colonists in New France, which was Canada. For the first time, France called upon their native allies, and England attempted to capture Quebec, but was unsuccessful. More and more native tribes began to take France's side during King William's War. For Queen Anne's War, which was fought from 1702 to 1713, England fought France in Europe again, and the English colonists fought the French colonists again, and they were unsuccessful again. But this time, England managed to successfully capture Nova Scotia. England used pirates like Blackbeard to fight the French in the Americas. After Queen Anne's War, we had King George's War. This one was fought from 1744 to 1748. Now I'll give you 3 guesses who it was fought between. That's right, it was England and France. Again, they're like siblings that just can't get along. In the colonies, Spain saw the war as a chance to invade Georgia. James Oglethorpe repelled the Spanish invasion. In New England, the colonists fought French forces in the north. And after they successfully took the French settlement of Louisbourg, which is Nova Scotia, England, however, after that, they gave Louisbourg back. And the New Englanders felt as though they had fought for nothing, and they became quite upset, as you can imagine. So fast forward just a little bit. During this time, we've had all of this English colonial expansion, where England is expanding their colonies out from just the little spots that they've got along the coastline. England gave 200,000 acres of land west of the Appalachian Mountains to the planters. France began to build a chain of forts in the Ohio River Valley to stop this English expansion. And the Virginia governor ordered a militia to stop the French from completing their newest fort, Fort Duquesne in Pittsburgh. The militia was yet led by a very young colonel, only 22 years old. This was George Washington. On his way to Fort Duquesne, Washington came across a few French soldiers who were on a diplomatic mission. Without questioning them, he ordered his men to open fire. After the skirmish, Washington took a few wounded soldiers captive. See, under the rules of the day, he was now responsible for taking care of them. But Washington's native allies murdered the captives. They were not bound by the same rules that Washington was. It was then that the French and Indian War, sometimes known as the 7 Years' War, began. Washington built Fort Necessity. This is a rebuilding of it, which is about 40 miles from Fort Duquesne. From there, he planned his attack on Duquesne, but he was ambushed by a large French and native force. He was outnumbered, he was forced to surrender, he was taken captive and demoted, and General Edward Braddock was put in charge. At first, England suffered defeat after defeat. It looked like they were going to lose to France again. In 1755, General Edward Braddock was defeated by a smaller French force, and the Native Americans began to ravage the colonial frontier. King George II was mad. He decided to put new leaders in charge, and that's when William Pitt became the new prime minister. England at this point began to win battles, and they had the support of the Iroquois tribes. Representatives from the colonies got together and met in Albany, New York. Ben Franklin was among them and recognized the colonies needed to protect themselves. He developed the Albany Plan of Union, which created an intercolonial government. It also created a system of recruiting troops and a tax system for the common defense. The colonies couldn't agree on the plan, but it was the first time they came together as a union. Maybe you recognize this flag, join or die. The colonies must come together, they must work together, and that's going to become very important in another 15 years or so. William Pitt began to take control of the fighting colonies, and he focused his attack on Canada, where most of the French were. The English retook Louisbourg and took control of Montreal. General James Wolfe scaled the cliffs that surrounded the Quebec in the middle of the night, and he also took that city. After the fall of 3 of their major settlements, France gave up. In 1763, the 3 major powers met in Paris to discuss peace, and they agreed on the Treaty of Paris. In this treaty, it said that England acquired French Canada and Spanish Florida. France agreed to give Louisiana to Spain, and France agreed to give up all land west of the Mississippi. Native Americans who had fought on both sides of this war were not even invited to the peace negotiations. So there were immediate effects after this. England became the supreme power in North America. They had the most land, they had the most influence. And England had proven, finally, that it was a dominant naval power. During the war, England developed a low opinion of the colonial military. They called them Yankee Doodles. And they saw colonists as a disorderly rabble. They saw the colonies as unwilling and unable to defend themselves. They basically saw the colonists as children who couldn't take care of themselves and needed to be protected by this mother country. Now, on the other hand, you got the colonists in America who felt that they had gained their military confidence and that they had won the war. They were not impressed by the English army. And then you've got the Native Americans who just feel slighted. They came to the table, they fought for both sides, they worked hard to help the English win, and then they were just largely ignored. The English became increasingly hostile toward Native groups, and they trusted them less and less. We had a big problem, though. During the war, England had racked up a massive war debt. And that's what we're going to talk about next.
From the very beginning, colonialism in America meant competition. European countries were eager to gobble up as much land as possible in the New World. Sometimes this competition turned into open warfare, and the French and Indian War is a perfect example of this. Here's a crash course of 5 things about the war to get you up to speed. North America was a big, beautiful place full of endless opportunities, and Great Britain and France each wanted a piece of the action. The British controlled their 13 colonies and were looking to expand west. The French occupied Canada and were looking to expand south. It was inevitable that they'd bump into each other, and that's exactly what happened in the Ohio River Valley, an important trading area with access to the Mississippi River. The French and Indian War marked the debut of 21-year-old George Washington, a lieutenant colonel for the militia in the British colony of Virginia. In 1754, he was ordered to protect a British fort near what is now Pittsburgh. On the way, Washington encountered a French military unit, and the two sides fought in the first battle of the French and Indian War, the Battle of Jumonville Glen. Washington was young, but he was quickly gaining the experience he would need to eventually command the Continental Army. Years of territorial scuffles turned into full-blown declarations of war in 1756. As fighting broke out, the British and French sought allies among the local Native American populations. The French were familiar with many tribes through trade and recruited the Potawatomi, Winnebago, Ojibwa, Mississauga, and the Huron, while the British turned to the Iroquois Confederacy. At first, the French were winning, a lot. They simply had more troops and better supplies than the British Army and drove them back towards the 13 colonies. But the tide turned in 1757 when British Secretary of State William Pitt took control of the war effort. Dreaming of a vast British Empire, he made it his mission to defeat the French in North America, pouring in generous funds to beef up military resources on the ground. The war ended with the French defeat at the Battle of Quebec and the signing of the Treaty of Paris in 1763. The British gained control of Canada and all land east of the Mississippi River. It may seem that the British made out well after all was said and done, but there was a catch. You see, William Pitt borrowed heavily to finance the French and Indian War, which left his nation in tons of debt. To make up for it, the British taxed American colonists up the wazoo. Americans didn't particularly appreciate this. Years of protests, rallies, town hall meetings, and petitions would eventually lead to the American Revolution and the creation of the United States. The French and Indian War may not have had the glorious battles or fearless heroes of other great conflicts, but it was one of the most consequential wars in American history. It also opened the eyes of a young military leader to the tyranny of the British, a man who would go on to be the first American president.
Okay, so England has just fought this war over in the colonies. And they spent all of this money on troops and supplies and transportation, and now they're rebuilding. They've got to have a way to pay for it. So what are they going to do? They're going to tax the colonies. The first one we have in 1765 is the Stamp Act. Britain passed a Stamp Act, which was a tax law requiring colonists to purchase special stamped paper for printed items. If you bought a newspaper or a book or a flyer or anything that was printed, you had to pay this tax for a stamp on it. The colonists harassed the stamp distributors, they boycotted British goods, and they prepared a declaration of rights and grievances in response to this. In 1767, we had the Townshend Acts. This was taxes on colonial imports and where they stationed troops at major colonial ports to protect customs officers. Now, if we said everything from Georgia is going to be taxed at this absurdly high rate, what do you think people would do today regarding any items that came out of the country, or not the country, the state of Georgia? Could be the country. Anyway, the colonists protested taxation without representation. They organized a boycott of imported goods. So if everything coming out of the state of Georgia is being taxed like crazy, you're probably not going to buy things from Georgia. And that's what the colonists did. They said, we're not buying anything from New England. In 1770, we had the Boston Massacre. The British troops stationed in Boston were taunted by an angry mob. Troops fired into the crowd, killing 5 men. Depending on which country you ask about this massacre, you will get different stories, even today, 300 years later. Depending on which country you ask about this massacre, you will get different stories, even today, 250 years later. The colonial agitators labeled the conflict a massacre. They published a dramatic engraving depicting the violence. And of course, that was their form of social media or news outlets. That's how they got the word out to the people about what had happened to stir up emotions. In 1773, we had the Tea Act. I bet you know what happened here. So Britain gave the East India Company special concessions in the colonial tea business, and they shut out colonial tea merchants. They said all the tea that's coming in is going to be from us. And the colonists got together, dressed up like Native Americans one night in December, and they dumped 15,000 pounds of East India tea into the Boston Harbor. In 1774, we had the Intolerable Acts. Remember, Britain is trying to control their colonies. They're trying to raise money to cover this war that they've just paid for. King George III tightened control over Massachusetts by imposing 5 new laws, which included closing Boston Harbor and quartering troops. So I've got a house with an extra bedroom. Not anymore. Now I have troops that I have no idea who they are, but Britain sent them over and they said that I'm going to pay for them to live at my house and I'm going to cover their food. Colonial leaders formed the First Continental Congress and they met to draw up a declaration of colonial rights. They've almost reached the end of their rope. And in 1775, we had Lexington and Concord. British General Gage ordered troops to march to Concord, Massachusetts, and seize colonial weapons. That's when we had the shot heard round the world. So Minutemen intercepted the British and engaged in battle. How did they know to be there? You've heard of Paul Revere. There were other people on that midnight ride besides Paul Revere, but they found out which way the British were going to be headed towards the armory to seize the gunpowder. And they went out in the middle of the night and they told the Minutemen, you need to come, you need to help protect this. And so that's what they did. They got up, and at first light in Lexington and then at Concord, we had the shot heard around the world. Now, eventually, of course, this led to the Declaration of Independence, at which point we got taxation with representation. And we'll talk about that a little more next week. So this week, you've got your writing prompts that you should be putting into your journals, your online journals. When I get ready for you to submit those, all you're gonna have to do is send the link. If you'll log into your Canvas, at the very top, it says submit assignment in blue. Just click on that, send the link. But for right now, I just want you to be writing them, editing them, looking over them. For your discussion question this week, I want you to log in and let's talk about something a little bit diverse. When we talk about the French and Indian Wars, when we talk about the Stamp Acts and all of the acts that led up to the American Revolution, we generally talk about it from the colonist point of view. I would like for you this week to choose either the English, the British point of view, or the Native American point of view, and put up 3 to 5 sentences on a particular topic. You can choose to write about how a Native American feels about not being included in the Treaty of Paris and the peace talks. You can talk about being a British soldier stationed in New England in this time prior to the Revolutionary War. I want you to choose an alternate perspective, since most of us are here in America taking American history, and try to put yourself in someone else's shoes and talk about your feelings about what's going on in the world at the time. After you have done that, you need to find 2 other people's threads and comment on theirs as well with meaningful discussion. And please remember to be disrespectful. Don't be disrespectful. Please remember to be respectful as you're writing your opinions. It is okay to disagree. It is not okay to be disrespectful. I look forward to seeing what everyone has to write and to seeing you get out of the box for a few minutes. And we will reconvene next week. Have a good week.